The California city of San Jose just passed a resolution severely restricting the locations of medical marijuana dispensaries. The 7-3 decision will affect nearly all of San Jose's roughly 80 pot shops into only a handful of industrial areas. The shop owners are up in arms, saying the resolution amounts to a ban. However, San Jose's move contradicts the general trend toward greater liberalization of marijuana, not just for medicinal purposes, but also for recreational use. Today, cannabis is legally available for purchase and use in Colorado and Washington, while several other states have legalized medicinal use. The state-by-state laws are still technically in violation of federal laws, which consider marijuana an illegal narcotic. However, Attorney General Eric Holder has made statements clarifying that federal agencies like the DEA would not prioritize raids of marijuana growers, as had happened a number of times under the Bush administration and most dramatically in California. Today, however, marijuana is big business and not restricted to providing pain relief for medical patients and the terminally ill. Now, award-winning journalist Peter Hecht, who writes for the Sacramento Bee and McClatchy newspapers, has written a new book meticulously documenting California's battle to legalize marijuana. It's called Weedland, Inside America's Marijuana Epicenter and How Pot Went Legit. He joins me in studio this morning. Welcome to Uprising, Peter.
Thanks. It's a pleasure being here.
So let's start briefly with the story of how a federal raid against a medical marijuana clinic of sorts in 2002, so 12 years ago, garnered national attention and catalyzed the movement to legalize pot. It was at the Santa Cruz-based Women's WO/Men's Alliance for Medical Marijuana, or WAM, when federal agents arrested the people who ran the group and confiscated their crop. You open your book with the story. How important was this incident?
Well, I use this to contrast everything that happened afterward. And what you had was essentially a communal garden for the sick of the sick. People with AIDS, cancer, leukemia, paralysis. You had wheelchair ramps between the plants. They all worked the garden. They shared the medicine at weekly meetings. Most got it for free. Some who could afford to pay paid nominally. And it was here that the Drug Enforcement Administration, led by a former U.S. Marine captain who had been diverted to serve as an air marshal fighting terrorists after 9/11 on flights out of New York and the Salt Lake City Olympics, staged the raid. And they rousted a polio patient from her bed. They arrested a husband caregiver, Mike Corral, and his wife, Valerie Corral, a Caesar sufferer who would later sort of become known as the Mother Teresa of medical marijuana, a title that she didn't particularly care for but was bestowed upon her nonetheless because of her passion for the issue. So what happened was many seriously ill patients and advocates blocked the DEA convoy, demanding information on the people that were arrested, and news media streamed in. It would become a national story for days afterwards. So even though Prop 215 had been around, that was the California law that legalized marijuana for medical use, had been around for 6 years, this really stirred the narrative of compassion, that this was something that seriously ill people were using to soothe their suffering, perhaps extend their life a little bit longer, and persevere. And the feds raided this, and it stirred an outrage. And the irony was the California lawmakers then reacted to protect places like WAM. So they passed a piece of legislation. It was called Senate Bill 420. And basically what it, yes, it was named for the pot moniker. And what it did was it allowed medical marijuana patients to collectively or cooperatively cultivate marijuana for medical purposes. Fast forward, what did cooperatives become? They became big cash-taking retail-style marijuana stores that took in millions of dollars of transactions and in and out, taking in and selling out thousands of pounds of marijuana. And it was an entirely different model than what you saw at WAM. So this book is sort of a story of contrast. It's a story of a movement of compassionate care for the sick that ultimately morphs into commerce, and it morphs into popular culture. And over the long term affects many aspects of politics, law, and indeed the social dynamic in California and beyond.
Well, let's talk about, let's go from Santa Cruz to Oakland, home of the so-called Oaksterdam University. Wikipedia describes Oaksterdam University as a non-accredited for-profit educational facility and political institution founded in November 2007 by medical marijuana activist Richard Lee to offer training for the cannabis industry with a mission to, quote, legitimize the business and work to change the law to make cannabis legal. Now, I'm assuming Oaksterdam is a play on Oakland meets Amsterdam, the Dutch city where marijuana is legally regulated. Who is Richard Lee and what is his motivation? And this was a university that was raided by federal authorities just like 2 years ago, right?
Yes, and Richard Lee is a remarkable character, and he symbolizes in many ways this sort of migration that took place to California. People were drawn to the movement. Richard Lee was a political science dropout from the University of Houston who decided on a life of adventure as a roadie for rock bands such as Aerosmith or
LL Cool J.
Shows how uncool that I am. And at one point, he had a traumatic fall while working in a warehouse in preparation for an Aerosmith concert and was paralyzed. And he turned to cannabis for relief and eventually became kind of an advocate. And then he comes to he comes to California and joins up with the movement and becomes sort of the master grower for the Oakland Cannabis Buyers Cooperative, which was one of the early dispensaries in California and really did serve the sick of the sick, AIDS patients, and other seriously ill people. And ultimately, he founds this university, which we in the press all had great fun with. It had a spoof emblem of the Harvard Veritas seal instead of it said cannabis. We all called it the Princeton of pot. And he saw this emerging industry, and he trained people for careers in it. He trained in cultivation and advanced plant science and the politics of marijuana, and he made money. Also by running a dispensary, so this is actually how I came into the story. I went down to Oakland because Richard Lee and others had pushed through America's first tax on medical marijuana, which A, brought revenue to the city, but B, added a layer of legitimacy to it. And he had this mantra, no taxation without legalization. And within months, he was pushing this initiative to legalize marijuana in California. And he was this unlikely protagonist because he wasn't part of the original movement, and the marijuana movement was fractured, but he was forging ahead. And at the same time, the California marijuana economy was exploding. So it became this national and international story. And ultimately it would lead later on to Washington and Colorado. But at the time, it was just this tremendous phenomenon that was very closely watched.
Now, the move to legalize marijuana is also accompanied by an explosion in medical research on marijuana, hasn't it? And this has come at the time when the famous Dr. Sanjay Gupta has had a very public change of heart on pot, going as far as making documentaries on the benefits of pot. What sort of research is happening, and how does that play into the commercialization story?
Well, the sad thing is that there's not a lot of current research right now. But what many people don't know, and the federal government is not too inclined to recognize, is that there was some truly landmark research that took place in California. And it grew out of the AIDS crisis in San Francisco when you had ultimately nearly 20,000 men, mostly men, who would die of AIDS. And you had at one point as many as 11,000 alleviating their symptoms through cannabis. And there was an oncologist doctor who became one of the leading AIDS practitioners in San Francisco, Dr. Donald Abrams, who was also openly gay, and his partner had died of AIDS. And he had observed that his partner had smoked cannabis and outlived several support groups. And he always thought that was kind of curious. And so at some point he begins pushing very aggressively for federal studies into the efficacy of marijuana as medicine. Well, the federal government pushed back because the key agency, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, doesn't like things that would show benefits. They prefer things that would show harm. And ultimately, he convinces them to accept a study to test whether marijuana would actually interfere with anti-AIDS medications. And they test patients at San Francisco General Hospital with marijuana, with Marinol, which is the synthetic THC, and with a placebo joint, basically, that is non-medicated. And what they found was not only did it not interfere with the anti-AIDS drugs, but the marijuana patients had significant weight gain, even more so than the Marinol group, and a huge increase in healthy blood cells. So after that, the California legislature then, during a flush budget year, approved $8.7 million for clinical trials. Right. And some of the top researchers in the University of California system, and these are not stoner advocates, these are serious doctors with a medical curiosity. They conducted multiple tests dealing with things such as pain relief related to nerve damage or diabetes or spinal cord injuries or spasticity from multiple sclerosis. And virtually all of the trials showed very promising medical benefits, and it's extended us beyond AIDS and beyond cancer and just mere symptom relief. And unfortunately, to this day, the federal orthodoxy is there is no accepted medical use for marijuana and a high potential for abuse. And the reason the feds can say that is that no more extensive studies follow that would have had to been approved by the FDA, involved many more trials, many more patients. So since the federal government never approved it, they're able to say there is no accepted medical use when the California studies clearly showed otherwise.
So what is the federal government's position under President Obama on states trying to legalize marijuana? Is it a clear one? Is Eric Holder to be trusted when he says that it'll be a low priority for federal agencies to raid marijuana growers?
Well, there were a couple of things that happened. Initially, there were a lot of people that wanted to get into this movement. Some for altruistic reasons, to help, for compassion, to help the sick, and others for purely commercial reasons because you could make a lot of money. And in 2009, there was a federal memo that said the government wouldn't target individuals in compliance with state medical marijuana laws. And everybody rushed in. The problem was they didn't read the rest of the memo, which defined those individuals as seriously ill patients or their caregivers, and went on to say that the feds would still target commercial operations. So it was an overreach it was irrational exuberance by cannabis speculators, and ultimately there was a federal backlash to that. But what we see now, Colorado and Washington have voted to legalize, and we now have what might be landmark terms of concession and an unraveling of federal drug policy. Because what the government said was, we're prepared to step back if you enact robust state controls. And what they mean is know where the product is coming from and going to, track the cash, have state oversight. They don't want interstate drug trafficking. They don't want criminal gangs in marijuana stores. They don't want it going to children. And they don't want environmental degradation from the illicit grows out in the forest and the public land. So the feds have kind of said, okay, states set clear rules.
And that sounds reasonable.
It's very reasonable. The cannabis community is still divided on exactly what the rules are. Some people think Colorado, which has a very strict regulatory regimen, is too strict. In California right now, there is a bill winding through the legislature that is looking at regulating this industry. This has the best chance of passing in 3 years. Ironically, the most remarkable thing is you have police now negotiating on this. You have the League of California Cities negotiating on this, two groups that have been very, very reluctant, if not outright hostile to cannabis liberalization. So we're in a very remarkable time right now, and it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
Well, here in California, just going from where we started in our conversation, where medical marijuana dispensaries were supposed to be nonprofit centers of compassion, many are now have seized on the money there is to be made. It's an open secret. You can essentially walk into the office of any number of doctors who advertise that they can give you prescriptions for back pain, insomnia, I mean, whatever you want. So how seriously has the commerce of pot evolved, and is there a downside to it? I mean, so what if pot is commercialized like alcohol or cigarettes?
Well, I think it's driven law enforcement and people opposed to marijuana liberalization to utter anger and distraction. And you can kind of see that because you really have this marketing of compassion, and that you can, and yet you can walk into these teeming medical cannabis conventions.
Right. No one markets alcohol as a way to soothe your medical pain necessarily, although alcoholics
so much.
might argue
otherwise. It
otherwise.
was great for
Right.
snake bites or something like that.
Sure.
But you walk into these conventions, and not only do you have every growing accessory ever dreamed of, and vaporizer pens and all these things, but you have bikini models and beauty contests, and you may have
like
somebody,
Budweiser girls, basically.
even more so. They will stand up there, and somebody may be wheeling past in a motorized chair who's paralyzed, and then you'll have these young women on stage explaining how they medicate and what their favorite strain is, and endorsing a cannabis accessory product. So this is where compassion meets commerce and popular culture, and this is where it becomes interesting. Now, in some ways, this also drives the legalization argument, because some people say, okay, we understand there's a lot of people that gain medical benefit. There are other people jumping on the bandwagon and using this as a conduit for recreational use. We don't see society, crashing into a burning pit. Maybe we should go ahead with legalization and separate the medical and non-medical constituencies on this.
Because if marijuana was something that doctors could, or that was widely prescribed by the establishment, I mean, would we also then see the pharmaceutical industry jumping in on marijuana purely for for patients and and the patient constituency, if you will?
Well, you already are to a degree, and you probably would to a certain degree more. I mean, obviously, Marinol is a pharmaceutical product that just synthetically created one element, THC. Ironically, the main psychoactive element. There's a product in Europe that's becoming available called Sativex. That's derived from the cannabis plant. So you will see some things like that. The interesting thing about the marijuana movement itself is a very, very anti-pharmaceutical strain that kind of runs.
It's almost a libertarian strain.
And it's both kind of this anti-corporatism thing, but also some people who kind of moved over from heavy-duty prescription painkillers to cannabis and found they could get the relief without the tremendous dependency issues and so forth, became real converts to that.
Well, finally and very briefly, Peter, whatever happened to the Women's Alliance for Medical Marijuana in Santa Cruz?
They still exist after all these changes. Well over 200 people have gone to their death, and many of them had their ashes scattered above the garden.
Wow.
And they continue on, the true collective.
Well, Peter, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. For our Southern California listeners, Peter Hecht is going to be speaking at the Barnes & Noble's in Santa Monica. That's on the 3rd Street Promenade tomorrow, Friday, June 13th, from 4 to 8 p.m. Again, that's tomorrow for our Southern California listeners. I'm assuming you'll have some Bay Area events as well. And do you have a website that people can find out more?
The website is www.weedlandbook.com. And you can go there for events, reviews, interviews such as this one, which will be up as soon as we can post it.
Great.
And more, and also there's links on where to get the book.
Again, the name of the book is Weedland, Inside America's Marijuana Epicenter and How Pot Went Legit. And my guest, the author, is Peter Hecht. Best of luck to you.
Thank you so much.